Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you had a very distinguished career as an attorney, so I want to ask you some legal questions. What is the difference between prosecutorial discretion and the wholesale failure to enforce a category of law?
Prosecutorial discretion is a prioritization. Now, somebody who's a low priority is not necessarily therefore beyond the reach of the law. They are a low priority, but they don't have any sort of status that says you hereby have amnesty.
Are there limits on the doctrine of prosecutorial discretion?
I'm sorry?
Are there limits on the doctrine of prosecutorial discretion?
DACA, as I understand it, is an act of
No. Are there limits
on an individual basis?
Are there limits on the theory of prosecutorial discretion? Are there any categories of law that the chief executive really actually has to enforce, and this time we really mean it?
As a lawyer, I will tell you I believe there are. I think that there comes a point where something looks like a wholesale abandonment of the enforcement of the law versus prosecutorial discretion. So I would agree with that assertion and that proposition.
Well, there are at least 3 different categories of law. Law can forbid conduct, like the possession of child pornography. Law can require conduct, like registration with selective service. And law can even tell one branch you have to do something, like sentence within these parameters. Does the doctrine of prosecutorial discretion apply to all 3 of those categories of law?
DACA is an individual assessment of people who are eligible for DACA treatment, and then they have to go through a process, a background check, and so forth.
I'm not just asking about DACA.
They're eligible for deferred
You were a
action.
prosecutor. Our Attorney General has concluded he doesn't like mandatory minimum, so they're no longer going to inform the grand jury or the sentencing court what the drug amounts are. I'm not talking about DACA specifically. I'm trying to determine whether there are any limits to this theory called prosecutorial discretion.
I believe there are.
Give me for instance, give me a category of law where you can't rationalize due to a lack of resources your failure to enforce a law.
Like I said, sitting here, I'm not sure I can answer specifically your question in hypothetical terms, but I do believe that there comes a point when something amounts to a wholesale abandonment to enforce a duly enacted constitutional law that is beyond simple prosecutorial discretion.
Well,
I'm agreeing with you in principle.
You mentioned in response to one of my colleagues' questions a lack of resources and a need to prioritize.
Right.
Can the legislative branch prioritize for you what we think your enforcement mechanisms ought to be, or the priorities of your department? Does it only come from the executive branch, or can the legislative branch say, we really want you to detain this category of alien, and we really mean it?
I think that's a good question. I think that there is a role for the legislative branch in making national priorities in how we enforce and prioritize the law. So, for example, if I may, Congress can ratchet up criminal penalties for certain things. That's an act of prioritization. I think that's an act of prioritizing, telling the executive branch where we want your priorities to be, and so there are enhanced penalties here.
But, Mr. Secretary, that enhanced penalty is meaningless if there's no prosecution. You would agree with me there. We can raise the statutory maximum on all crimes. If you mean to tell me the executive branch has the unfettered discretion not to enforce a category of law, what difference does it make what the statutory maximum is? Nobody's ever going to be prosecuted.
That's not what I said.
No, but you cited something the legislative branch can do, which is raise the statutory maximum.
Right.
What I'm trying to get at is what can the legislative branch do when we want, and I'm not talking about immigration right now, I'm talking about any category of law, if we really want the law enforced. I mean, this time we really mean it, Mr. President. We want you to enforce the law. What are our remedies?
I think that the legislative branch in general, whether it's the enforcement of immigration laws, the enforcement of criminal laws, or how we conduct counterterrorism operations, needs to be careful not to intrude into the discretion that the executive branch should normally have. You cannot, with all respect, micromanage certain functions that the executive is charged with carrying that out. And I've seen, I know from experience, as an AUSA or as the General Counsel of the Department of Defense, responsible for signing off on the legality of specific military operations, that the legislative branch can and should and has the prerogative to set the broad parameters for national policy, and the executive should be given a certain amount of discretion based on existing circumstances to implement and enforce those laws. And there's a line between those two that I think is probably a little difficult to articulate, but I believe both branches have a role in that process.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm out of time. But, Mr. Secretary, I will say this in conclusion. Our politics may differ. I don't have any idea. I don't know you well enough to know. But you're a former prosecutor, and there are other former prosecutors on this committee. And the beauty of this country is even if our politics differ, we still respect the rule of law, and we are playing with the foundation of this republic. When we decide selectively which laws we're going to enforce due to political expediency, that transcends politics, and it begins to impact the foundation of this republic. And I would urge you to help me find where that line is between prosecutorial discretion and just deciding you don't like to enforce a law.